Good evening and welcome to our conversation on solidarity and I guess multicultural get-togethers. I disclaimer, I am recovering from total knee surgery replacement, so I may be a little loopy tonight, but my heart is in the right place. And not in our town, we always begin with our land acknowledgement, and that I can read. The land on which we are living is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people. We pay respect to the Lenni Lenape people past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in their homeland and in the diaspora. We also acknowledge the millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants on whose backs this nation was created. Not in Our Town mission statement. Not in Our Town, Princeton is a multiracial, multi-faith group of individuals who stand together for racial justice and inclusive communities. Our focus is to promote the equitable treatment of all and to uncover and confront white supremacy, the system that facilitates the preference, privilege, and power of white people at the expense of non-white people, and pits racial and ethnic groups against each other by upholding hierarchies based on proximity to whiteness. Our goal is to identify and expose the political, economical, and cultural systems which enable white supremacy to flourish, and to create new structures and policies which will ensure equity and inclusion for all. In our commitment to uncovering the blight of white supremacy on our humanity, we take responsibility to address it and eliminate it in all its forms through intentional actions, starting with ourselves and our communities. Thank you so much. And I'd like to say, Connie, take it away.
Thank you, Joyce. So I'm Connie Alengovan, and I'm a board member of Not in Our Town, Princeton, and also I'm a founder of Make Us Visible New Jersey, a coalition of students, parents, and educators that successfully advocated for the passage of the Asian American and Pacific Islander curriculum bill, which requires that all New Jersey schools teach AAPI curriculum in grades K through 12. On May 12th at 7 p.m., Princeton Public Library will be hosting a virtual panel discussion with Make Us Visible New Jersey board members, where we will discuss our journey in advocating for this bill and our work towards implementation. And I hope you can join us. Tonight, I'm very honored to introduce tonight's speaker, Lynn Burnett, founder of crossculturalsolidarity.com. Crossculturalsolidarity.com aims to become a place where people can plug into the entire universe of racial justice history. There are currently over 100 racial justice history resources available, as well as a plan to build 200 more over the next 2 years. The project is especially committed to lifting up histories of multiracial solidarity. Achieving racial equity and building a strong, robust democracy requires all of us to unite, be we Black, brown, or white. At the core of cross-cultural solidarity's vision is that multiracial unity is strengthened when we know one another's histories and when we see powerful examples of embodied solidarity. Cross-cultural solidarity lifts up all things racial justice while bringing a special focus to Black, brown solidarity and white anti-racism in US history. The project was founded by former high school teacher Lynn Burnett, who used stories of multiracial solidarity to inspire his students. As a white man, Lynn is especially focused on using the lessons to be learned from white anti-racist history to strengthen white anti-racist mobilization today. During this program, Lynn will discuss the genesis of the project and how Black and brown solidarity inspired his students and ignited his own passion and vision for solidarity. He'll discuss compelling examples of Black and brown solidarity in US history and describe the role that white anti-racist history can play in strengthening racial justice movements. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all so much for inviting me to be here with you all tonight. And I really look forward to hearing your own thoughts and your own questions and curiosities. And I think I wanted to start just by saying that my own vision of solidarity is really rooted in actually something that Connie lifted up in our discussion before we really, before other people were joining, which is that, for me, I cannot envision building a racially just world or a robust democracy or a socially just, country outside of multiracial organizing, outside of multiracial coalitions. I think that that's the path forward. And I think that having examples of what Black and Brown solidarity has looked like in history and what white anti-racism has looked like in history can help us reflect on, what that solidarity looks like. It can help us reflect on what has worked well in the past in terms of building multiracial coalitions. And it can also help us reflect on some of the things that didn't work so well. And we have an opportunity by looking at the history to reflect on, how we can do better, in terms of what we need to do moving forward to build the world that we all deserve to live in. So that's my own belief in solidarity and feeling like it's so essential. But the roots of the project really go back to my experience as a high school history teacher, working in a school that was about a third Black, a third Latino, and a third Asian American. There was some Native American, representation in the school. There were absolutely no white students. This was in a neighborhood called Deep East Oakland. There was a lot of gun violence in the community. Probably 2 or 3 days a week during class, we would hear gunfire in the distance. And there was a lot of trauma that was brought into the school and into the classroom. And sometimes that trauma manifested in the form of Black on brown tensions. So a lot of the fights that we had on campus were Black on Asian or Black on Latino. And so one of the things, that I began to think about as a teacher is, what could I do? How could I use history to somehow do some healing in this context, with what my students were experiencing? And so that's really the birth of my own commitment to learning about and teaching myself the history of Black and Brown solidarity, and then to bringing it into my classroom. And in order to do that, I often had to write the stories myself, because a lot of the great material that I found was not written in a way that was accessible for my students. So that's also the birth of me as someone who started to write about racial justice history in order to bring, those stories into my classes. And what I found was really, beautiful and compelling. If I brought in a story, for example, about Yuri Kochiyama, who's a Japanese American disciple of Malcolm X's, and she's literally the woman who holds Malcolm as he dies. If I brought that story into my classroom, I would literally have my Asian American students and my Black students looking at each other, smiling, being like, yes, you and me. It was something that they felt, and that brought them joy, and that brought them a lot of my students felt like, a lot of my students were students who, told me that, they often felt pretty alienated from politics in American society. They probably had a really progressive or left vision, but a lot of them, they were like, the Democratic Party is not going to do anything, for me. And a lot of them felt like, it was hard for a lot of my students to envision the possibility, to be involved in the world, or the possibility for change. And one of the things that I saw was that when I brought in these stories of Black and Brown solidarity to my classroom, that helped my students to see that, like what I'm facing and what my community is facing, I always felt like we'd be facing it alone. But actually there's a possibility, that, looking at another example I brought in, like the Black Panther Party, working really closely with the farm workers movement, and seeing my students seeing examples, of the Black Panthers, like boycotting with the farm workers and marching with the farm workers. And Cesar Chavez, even though he had there were different ideologies at play in those two groups, but they both supported each other. And when my students saw that, it was like, you know what, we're not in this alone. We can work together. And when they could imagine their communities working together, it allowed for a greater sense of what was possible, in a way that I think was really empowering for them. And so that was the birth of my own commitment to learning about Black and Brown solidarity and teaching about it. And it was ultimately what led me to want to found, a website that lifted up that history. Because when I first founded Cross-Cultural Solidarity, it wasn't necessarily very, very easy to find a place where you could plug into, all the different dimensions that Black and Brown solidarity, exist. So right now, if you go to, the website, there's examples of, Black and Asian solidarity in history, Black and Asian solidarity on the contemporary scene, Black and Latino solidarity in history, another page for the contemporary. And I'm working on some stuff about Black and Indigenous solidarity. And actually I was reading some great stuff with Stokely Carmichael supporting the American Indian movement just before I plugged into this thing. So I'm kind of working on lifting that up. And I'm really happy to say that some of those resources that I've created they've been there at certain moments when it seemed like our society kind of needed them. And I just want to lift up, two examples. One was during the month after George Floyd was murdered, we had this moment where there's white people pouring out into the streets. They're asking how they could show up for racial justice. And I had put together a resource page about, contemporary white anti-racism that had links to, organizations and had links to, major thinkers and to kind of examples of what that work looked like in a really excellent way. And during the month after George Floyd was murdered, that page was visited 25,000 times. 3,000 people clicked on the link to the different SURGE chapters. SURGE is a national white anti-racist organization with 150 chapters. So I'm proud that, for me, I feel like, in the world of when we think of things going viral, I think often we think in the terms of hundreds of thousands and millions, but for me, 25,000 people clicking on that at a moment when they were really trying to figure things out. And hopefully some of those 3,000 people, actually ended up in SURGE chapters. And likewise, my Black and Asian solidarity page, during this terrible time that we've been living in with the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, has been, that page has been retweeted by, it's been shared by, tons of civil rights organizations and especially Asian American civil rights organizations, and it's on a bunch of ethnic studies websites. And Sherilyn Eiffel of the NAACP, Legal Defense and Educational Fund, recently retweeted, that out. And once again, it's kind of like, I'm happy that those resources were there at the right time, when there were crises happening, and when people were searching for those. I want to also say something about kind of my broader hope for creating a website that helps to be, that can act as an entry point into the wider world of racial justice history. Because cross-cultural solidarity has a focus on resources that lift up multiracial organizing, but it's also a place where, I have dozens of resources on different variations of systemic racism and white supremacy, and dozens of resources on different dimensions of the Black freedom struggle, in the Chicano movement, and, and hoping to build a couple hundred more over the next couple of years. And that also feels like solidarity to me, like simply grounding ourselves in the history, grounding ourselves in the history of white supremacy. I don't see how we come together and work together if we don't have a robust awareness of what those systems look like, So that seems foundational to solidarity for me as well. And understanding the history of the Black freedom struggle and the history of the American Indian movement and all the different histories that we could think of, these are ways of knowing each other and knowing where our communities come from that lay important foundations for us to be able to really work together. And I want to give a historical example that I think gets to this. There's a moment in the Chicago campaign, in Martin Luther King's Chicago campaign, where he's fighting against housing discrimination. He's fighting against racialized poverty in Chicago, and he invites Latino leaders to come and participate, in one of these demonstrations. And so you have these Latino leaders who represent their neighborhoods and have their own organizations show up, to be at this march with King. And then King ends up not really mentioning them, very much. And unsurprisingly, they don't show up, again. Moving forward a few years, he's organizing the Poor People's Campaign. Of course, it's a multiracial coalition to fight poverty across the United States. And in the beginning of the Poor People's Campaign, there's a meeting called the Minority Group Conference. And in the Minority Group Conference, there's indigenous leadership present, poor white leadership present, especially from Appalachia. There are representatives, of Cesar Chavez, I think, had just ended a fast. So there was someone who was representing him. And there were other representatives of the Chicano movement, who were there. And they were all ready to have this multiracial struggle together. And one of the pieces of feedback that they gave Martin Luther King was, they said, you know what, like in the course of this, in the course of our discussions, we haven't gotten the impression that you understand the specific struggles of indigenous people, because what we face is different than what the Black community faces. And we haven't gotten the impression that you understand what migrant farm workers, are facing, and the issues regarding deportation and language barriers, and like different ways that white supremacy affects us. And so we really want to work together, Martin Luther King, but we also want to make sure that we are represented, and that the specific ways that white supremacy affects us are worked on, in the struggle. And so Martin Luther King actually makes a commitment to tour Native American reservations and to tour migrant farm labor camps and meet with Latino and Native American communities all across the country. And of course, he's assassinated before this ends up, becoming a possibility. But I think it really goes to show that it's just important to know something. If we're going to build multiracial coalitions, we need to understand our communities. We really need to know each other. And so in that sense, thinking about cross-cultural solidarity as a place where people can just plug into all the different dimensions of racial justice history, I think that also lays important foundations, for being able to work together and build the coalitions that we need. And it feels especially important, obviously, I think, in the day and age that we're currently living in, with the attacks, on CRT and the attacks on ethnic studies that have been going on for a long time. All of that undermines our ability simply to know each other and to know the history of our communities and what our specific struggles are, and that undermines our ability to work together. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to talk about the White Anti-Racist Ancestry project. And this is a project that it's actually part of the cross-cultural solidarity project, but it's a part that I'm really focusing on as a white person who is concerned with, how we mobilize white people for racial justice specifically. And I decided to create this project after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And to give a little bit of a backstory here, during the whole Black Lives Matter era, I had seen over and over again these moments, when Trayvon Martin, was murdered, or Philando Castile was murdered. There's all these moments when a lot of white people are feeling like they want to figure out how they can show up for racial justice, and there's a lot of energy around that. And so I've been watching those moments for a long time, and especially around Philando Castile, I plugged into the local surge chapter specifically to help to onboard the hundreds of people who wanted to join the surge chapter in that particular moment in the summer of 2016. And what I saw was that, you know, the interest, the energy and the momentum and the interest only lasts so long. You know, I knew that. And when those people joined Surge, you know, probably 90% of them were gone, you know, 6 months later or a year later. So I had this question during the height of the 2020 uprisings, you know, how do we really bring these white folks in? You know, how do we really bring them in? What are the resources that we need to do this? And the thing that I came up with as someone who writes about history, who writes about racial justice history, was that, you know, there were so many white folks who were asking how we show up. And I was thinking, you know, in the course of especially studying Black freedom struggle history, you know, I'd seen so many profound examples, just really deep, incredible examples of excellent white anti-racism. And I realized that a lot of folks, you know, who were asking those questions of how do we show up probably didn't know anything about that history. And so the basic premise of the White Anti-Racist Ancestry Project is that it will be easier for us to mobilize masses of white people for racial justice if they have inspiring, you know, profound and inspiring examples of what truly excellent white anti-racism looks like. So I seek to do that through lifting up those examples, through lifting up examples from U.S. history. I'm specifically looking at creating a few types of resources. I want to go over those really briefly, just to give an example of what's being created in that project. I'm creating 6 or 7 different types of resources. I'm just going to talk about 3 of them. And each of these have a specific strategic use value. So one of the resources I'm creating is I'm developing a collection of 101 short 1 to 2 page pieces about a wide variety of white anti-racists in US history. And the strategic use value of that is that, you know, they're short, they're accessible, it allows it to get out there, you know, into society. It allows white people to find white anti-racists who they can, you know, identify with. It shows how white anti-racists from every region of the country, every, you know, sexual orientation, every class background, you know, wherever you're coming from, there are white anti-racists who are coming from those places. And it shows how white anti-racists have brought every conceivable skill also into the service of the movement, which I think helps us to imagine how we could bring our skills, whether it's, you know, being a researcher or being a photographer or being a teacher, whatever it is. There are white people who have leveraged those skills in the service of the movement. And I think that that's powerful to see. It's also a really great resource for parents and teachers of white children to use, these really short, accessible pieces. And I think that one of the things that we really need to be doing, you know, speaking, you know, to white folks, is we need to be raising a white anti-racist generation. That's really critical. And we need to be thinking about the resources that we need, you know, to raise that generation. And my hope is that these short pieces can be, you know, such a resource. The second type of resource is developing a series of chapter-length pieces on especially pivotal examples of white anti-racism. So the strategic value of a chapter-length piece is that's where I can explore the white anti-racist emotional journey and the growing process and the humbling moments and the mistakes that are made and how people learn from mistakes. And, you know, as well as the brilliant organizing and strategizing, and all of that allows the chapter-length piece to be a platform for white people to reflect on their own lives, you know, their own future growth, where they've come from, as well as to engage in some imagining of how they can maybe, you know, organize, you know, better themselves. And the third type of resource I'm working on is telling the stories of movement elders. I'm in touch with many white anti-racist movement elders, and I hope to tell as many of their stories as I can. And I'm really proud, especially of working with a man named George Herbeck, who founded a white anti-racist spiritual community in Chicago, which he brainstormed personally with Martin Luther King regarding, you know, what would an ideal, you know, white anti-racist community look like. And he founded it and, you know, worked on the breadbasket campaign with Jesse Jackson, worked with Fred Hampton in Chicago. And he turned 90 years old during the time that I was interviewing him. So being able to work with these movement elders and tell their stories feels almost, sacred to me, to get some of that, recorded, in history while we still can. And then also to do the work of connecting those movement elders to younger generations of white anti-racism as well. And what I'll close with is saying something about, I want to say something about why organizing white people is really, important, and then we could open it up for discussion. Something that I think any white person who takes a deep dive, into Black freedom struggle history, it really strikes you that there is like this multi-generational, omnipresent call, like coming from the Black freedom struggle for white people to organize other white people. It's everywhere you look throughout that history. And the reason why is that it's pragmatic and it's practical. There's a recognition that, if we don't get a lot of white people to change, we cannot create a truly racially equitable country unless a whole lot of white people don't change their consciousness and their behavior, and the way they act in the world. So when we think of, keeping our eyes on the prize, to me, that means taking down systemic racial inequity. It's multi-generational, it's long haul, and we don't get there unless we mobilize a lot of white people. And so the Black freedom struggle has been making that ask for a very long time. And I think my hope is that we're finally at a point where we can do that on a more massive scale, or I think we are doing that on a more massive scale than has ever been done before, but we also have a long way to go. So I think that, for me, I'm focusing on providing those, powerful examples from history, but I think something that all white people should be thinking about is what are the resources, what's the range of resources that we need in order to successfully mobilize white people for racial justice. And the last thing that I'm going to say is that white anti-racists have a very strong commitment to supporting Black and brown, racial justice efforts. That's the primary commitment that I see. However, I think that there's a second thing that requires more focus than what I see happening at the national level, which is that if we don't mobilize white people for racial justice, we don't build a stronger foundation for supporting Black and brown-led racial justice efforts. So the two main priorities that I see white anti-racists having, supporting Black and brown-led racial justice efforts, mobilizing white people, but it's the mobilizing white people which is really the foundation for that second major priority that white anti-racists have. And once again, I would just want to invite everyone to reflect on what are the various resources that we need to succeed in doing that. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and close it out or open it up to whatever's on your hearts and minds.
Thank you so much, Lynn. So if anyone, I see that Linda's raised her hand, but please feel free to put your questions either in the chat or to simply raise your hand or speak when appropriate. Linda, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you so much, Lynn. This is very informative, and for thank you for this presentation, but also for your research. And my question has to do with the combinations of people. In your research, have you seen a difference in dynamics when the multiracial solidarity is among only people of color, or compared with when white people get involved, not in white only, but when they are involved in spaces and organizations with people of color?
Let's see. I actually, I would love to see the speaker. I'm trying to, is anyone else, is there a way that I can see the speaker who's talking? Because I got a little bit distracted. I was trying to figure that out.
Linda, do you want to raise your hand again? That should, does that help?
Maybe not.
Lynn, did I unspot?
Oh no, I see Carolyn with her hand raised.
Here, okay. Linda's physically raising her hand.
Oh, okay.
And Lynn, if you have it on gallery view, you should be able to see.
Yeah, here I can spotlight you both. Maybe that'll help. that helpful?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
I hate to ask you to repeat the question, but would you be able to repeat the question for me?
Sure. I want to know, in the course of your research, have you seen a difference in dynamics between cross-cultural solidarity among only people of color of various colors, and when white people are involved in multiracial solidarity?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I feel like I don't have an excellent answer for it. The thing that jumps out to me is that when I've looked at Black and Brown solidarity historically, when I look at white anti-racism historically, there are often plenty of imperfections and tensions and things that don't work out, and when I look at Black and Brown history or solidarity in history, there's often, for example, when I go back to the Black Panther Party and the farm workers movement, there's often real concerns, of anti-Blackness within the Latino community that a lot of the Black Panther Party were concerned about. And then on the other hand, a lot of the farm workers felt like the folks in the Panthers were coming, into that coalition, feeling like they were the experienced organizers and maybe being a little bit paternalistic in a way that turned off the farm workers. So I've seen that, there's often some kind of tension and misunderstanding, in the history that I've looked at, that building the successful multiracial coalition often means, to go to the example of Martin Luther King, being humble, being really humble and saying, you know what, you're right. I'm trying to build this coalition, but I'm very focused on, what Black Americans need specifically. And I do need to do that. I do need to do that learning about what Indigenous folks face. So once again, I don't think I have the perfect response to your question, but I guess it just inspires more curiosity in myself.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Carolyn?
Carolyn.
Hi, Lynn. First, I want to say thank you. Right, I truly appreciate the perspectives, right, and the on-the-ground work that you've done. You mentioned something. You mentioned about Martin Luther King when he was having his discussions, and then the Latino community showed up and he didn't give them airtime, if you will.
Yeah.
Right. And then MLK, again, with the indigenous community, right? And they said, like, you don't understand what happens on the reservations, right? Yeah. And then he died. But my, it's not really a question, but it's an observation that does the Latino community know what goes on in the Black community? And do the indigenous people know what goes on in the Black community, right? So I find like there is always an expectation that the Black community should understand everybody's struggle, right? And then everybody benefits from the foundational struggle of Black people and the civil rights movement and the laws and et cetera, right? Everybody benefits from that. And then they don't turn around and remember the struggle of the Black folks who set the foundation for that. So I feel like, MLK not giving the Latino community the airtime. But my question is, were they giving other Black leaders, when they're in their forums, airtime, right? I'm just saying that I feel like anti-Blackness is so foundational that there is this expectation, I believe, that somehow we're so foundational that we have to get it for everybody, but they don't have to get it for us. And in fact, if it was a two-way street, like it should have been, when MLK died, then that initiative wouldn't have died.
Yeah.
Right? That you know what I'm saying? Like that relationship that was being built wouldn't have died, right? Because they would have understood and have had a place and trust in the Black community.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's just an observation of mine. And I just wanted to make sure, like, we're not replicating an implicit bias when we're trying to eradicate bias.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Something that comes up for me is when I think about the tensions that existed at that particular moment, one of them was exactly what you just spoke to. One of them was this feeling that, the Black freedom struggle had changed the legal system and changed things in the United States in ways that benefited absolutely everybody. And there sometimes was a feeling in the Black community during in these coalition spaces that sometimes that wasn't appreciated. So it's actually something that contributed, to some of the distrust that was there, in some of the coalition building. I don't know exactly, when you ask the question of, when Black leaders went into Latino communities or indigenous communities, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how they were received. I feel like so much of what I've looked at has been the Black freedom struggle being kind of the central thing that's happening, and indigenous and Asian and Latino community coming into like Black freedom struggle spaces. Although I guess I did give a different, talking about the Black Panthers supporting the farm workers, I think that was a little bit different. I'm not sure if I'm getting to your primary question though.
It wasn't really a question. It was just an observation that, I hear you and I appreciate the, all the research and all the, work that you're doing, but I just wanted to make sure that, as you go out and spread this words, that there's that perspective, because I feel like it's not spoken about, and it's so nuanced that we almost, it's so accepted that we don't even realize that there is this burden and this kind of, expectation amongst Black folks that we appreciate everybody else's struggle and we don't expect the same of others, when in fact, I mean, anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenousness is the foundation of the country.
Yeah, I think the one last thing that I want to say in response is that I think that it's basically, and this is just my own personal feeling. I think it's I think it makes a lot of sense I think it's kind of unfair to expect, one group of people to understand all the other groups of people. And it makes a lot of sense that like your struggle is your struggle and it's going to be the thing that you're primarily focused on. Like that just is human. That just makes sense. And so for there to be any expectation that any one group would understand all the others, I think that would be an unfair expectation. And I think maybe the takeaway is that when coalitions are being built at that moment, it makes sense to do that learning and that, and building that understanding at that specific moment. But until that moment comes, I think it might be unfair to have those expectations. Once again, that's just my own feeling.
Thanks, Caroline. And thanks, Lynn. Denise?
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thanks, Carolyn, for your question. I'm sort of going to build on her observation. I was watching PBS NewsHour, and they had a big discussion about the issue of the children being separated from their parents at the border, the way Trump dealt with immigration. And they mentioned, oh my God, children were separated from their parents. What trauma, what torture, let's get ready. What kind of reparations can we come up with for these families? God, everything, these same things happened to Black people as slaves from the beginning of time. Mothers were separated from their children. It took years after the Civil War to even put families back together again. Torture, unimaginable torture, even after, you know, I'm reading the Red Summer book about, you know, one thing, all the lynchings and whatever, but there's always this hesitation to think that Black people should have any kind of reparations at all. But anybody else, something comes up, these people who definitely suffered, but they're not even American citizens yet. And yet there's a court case to make sure that there are reparations provided to the separated families. And to me, I'm like, I was sitting there watching this story and I was going along with it and saying, and I said, well, boy, what if I replaced everywhere where they mentioned this Latino family and their children, if they put Black people in there, they would, as soon as you know it's about Black people, the thought of reparations for Black people, forget about it. Even with Harvard and all the other recent developments in higher ed, and beginning with Brown, willing to do almost anything except provide reparations for the absolute mistreatment, torture, separation of families, abuse, use of your labor. The descendants of slaves have never been recognized in this country. So I do understand that there's a wonderful intersection between Black people and everybody else in the struggle, but there's always this hesitation in America to recognize the incredible torment and torture that 400 years of being slaves in this country represent. And then after that, always being considered lesser than, and then having entire, you know, eugenics, having entire research, academic research promulgated on the world that support white supremacy, that supports Nazism. Well, that started in America. And it was about trying to make sure that Black people were not considered human beings. That's core and fundamental. They weren't doing it about Native Americans. They weren't doing it about Latino people. They were doing it about Black people so they didn't feel so bad about enslaving Africans. So that's my observation.
Could I ask you a question? I'm curious. Well, first I want to say, when I look at Asian American solidarity, you know, with Black folks, I often see the reparations brought up in that context. A lot of folks who went through the internment, or I don't think internment is the proper word, you know, I think they're concentration camps. But the folks who were put into the Japanese who were put into concentration camps, and I just want to make a distinction between death camps in Nazi Germany and concentration camps in America. A lot of those folks came out and were saying, you know, especially after they did get some form of reparations, there were a lot of Japanese Americans who were speaking up and saying, you know, this is messed up, you know, that we got this, but Black Americans, after all the centuries of slavery and Jim Crow, haven't gotten that. So I have seen that solidarity. But my question for you, I'm curious. I guess I want to like visualize like what that solidarity might ideally look like. You know, if we could imagine there being some, you know, some real push for, you know, reparations, you know, for Black folks in the United States. I just find myself wondering what does multiracial solidarity look like in order to bring that about, and who would be at the forefront and who would be speaking about it, and how would they? I'm just imagining, I don't know.
Denise, you're muted.
Okay. The very organization that's bringing the suit for these immigrants could be bringing the suit on behalf of Blacks first. The AFL-CIO, I think they're the organization that are bringing the suit. Class action suit. Make this suit the premier suit. That's the #1 suit. Before anybody else has their hands out, let's take care of that for ACLU. Yeah, take care of these people who have been waiting in line for an extremely long time, and then take care of other people.
Mm-hmm. I mean, on the white anti-racist front, you know, I think that white anti-racists have, you know, I feel like it should really be coming from them, more than anyone else. I feel like in terms of fighting for reparations, that feels like, you know, the white Americans have historically done that harm, you know, and I think it should really be coming from them, you know, to push that forward. So I just want to express that would be my hope, would be to see that happening in the future.
And I would say that your resources on reparations are very extensive. And our Black Voices book group, and also the Benny the Moral Arc discussions about courageous conversations, we have researched this subject too. And it's a tough question for Americans to come to grips with, but it's one that needs to be addressed honestly and authentically.
Yeah, I appreciate
Thank
it.
you for your work.
Thank you for your sincere
Thank
comment.
you both. So is now a good time? Does anyone else have a burning question, or is it?
No, I do.
Okay, Joanne.
okay.
go ahead. Thank
All
you.
right. And I really, truly like what you were talking about tonight, but I have to back up with Linda, Lynn, and Caroline. And what Lynn was saying, I think what I got out of it is, why do we, as African Americans, Black folks, have to constantly apologize for what other folks have done to us and not be recognized? In your report, you talked about how the white superior needs to be able to, we have to reach out to them, and they have to recognize. They're already recognized. The other thing is, white folks already know.
Joanne, just so you know, you broke out just now.
Right. She froze. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Joanne, you're frozen right now.
It'll be a very powerful thing, and white superior folks and folks have to recognize that. So I'm just saying, you did an excellent job tonight. I thank you for all your information, but at the same time, I just want to know why, once again, African American folks have to still wait when everybody else, you talked about the Japanese, you talked about everybody else getting paid or taken care of. And here we go again, who have worked in this country, have built this, has still had to sit on the back burner of everything and be placed.
You cut out about halfway through, so I feel like I might have missed an important part of what I'm wondering if I can get to the essence of
I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry that you broke out.
Joanne, you got muted. And then Joyce also has a question. Joanne, you're muted. Oh.
Joanne, you're muted.
You're
right
muted, Joe.
No, I'm muted now, but I'm saying I didn't know, because he said he was frozen. I wasn't frozen, he was frozen. And the only thing I'm saying is, once again, here we go again, African Americans have to apologize for what other folks have done to us. And we're the last one to receive anything, but we're the one that have kept this country above. And my other thing is, there's somebody who don't look like me is in front, who wants to represent us, is acceptable. But when we are trying to represent our own people, trying to represent us, everybody have to come, they come in like they want to attack that individual because they don't look like them. And that's what you call about being white superior.
Mm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Joyce, did you have a question?
Yeah. Oh, I do. Kind of like what Carolyn said, and I'm still not struggling, but this whole notion of anti-Blackness is so embedded in our culture, in our American way, and it's almost like if anti-Blackness is acknowledged by white supremacy, then that would cause them to really have to do something about it. And every time we try to bring up reparations for African Americans, you know, like the Senate, everybody kind of shoots it down because there's such a connection between white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And it really would cause white folks to have to take pause and to, I guess this is just kind of like a statement, I don't know, but it would have to take pause and have white folks really kind of acknowledge the harms. And right now, I just don't think white people want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so Lynn, I'm kind of like, you know, at a crossroads, at a struggle. I have an idea of what I would like to see, like a multicultural coalition look like. It's pretty much in our mission statement how white supremacy pits us all against each other, and that's where I want us to kind of begin looking at, like, us joining forces with people that have been harmed by white supremacy. So I guess that's my statement.
Yeah, I hear that. I feel that one thing that needs to be done in terms of solidarity is that a lot of different groups need to wrestle with anti-Blackness. You know, when I look at, you know, what was going on with, you know, after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, the Asian American community was really that was part of, you know, white folks were showing up saying, what's my role, and figuring out how to plug in, and a lot of Asian Americans and a lot of Latino Americans we're saying like, hey, we need to wrestle with anti-Blackness in our community. So I feel like, you know, that's a big part of solidarity, is a lot of different communities wrestling with anti-Blackness. And I think, you know, in terms of what you said about, you don't think white people are there in terms of reparations, you know, in terms of like what white Americans would have to wrestle with, I completely agree with you. And once again, that feels like it's kind of like, you know, people like me, you know, I feel a responsibility to mobilize white people and to help other white people mobilize white people. And I feel like that's one of the things, like I said, when I think of what it means to keep our eyes on the prize, ultimately, I think it means taking down systemic racial inequity. And I don't think we get there unless we change a lot of white Americans. And it seems to be once again, the primary responsibility of folks like me is to be mobilizing white people for racial justice. And if we change enough, you know, if we change the consciousness of enough white Americans, then I think things like reparations become a lot more possible. But I agree with you right now. It feels, it's hard for me to imagine that happening, you know, anywhere on the near horizon.
And I can honestly say that, like after the murder of Mr. George Floyd, and there were so many, you know, white folks, at least visibly involved, which I think really caused, I don't know, the powers to be, the government, to really kind of like take a step back, because it's like, it's almost like if white folks are going to be involved with, you know, the African-American community in terms of, you know, supporting the African-American community and like changing policy and changing laws, it's like the structure, that whole white supremacy system kind of like gets really riled up and gets crazy. It's like, but then they'll take away all of our power and we can't have that. So, you know, then we get all the craziness that we have going on now. If you look at any of the political commercials, I guess, politicians, definitely for the state of Pennsylvania, oh my God, they're screaming white supremacy. And it's just mind-boggling to see how many people are really like fighting that, you know, taking that bullet or taking that, you know. So Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joyce. Sherry, I'm going to spotlight you now.
Hi. It's such an important conversation. I just thank you so much for what everybody has said, and Lynn, for your amazing work. I just want to mention the work of Resmaa Menakem, the My Grandmother's Hands piece. I feel like in thinking about this question, the only thing that I've seen come close to dismantling white supremacy and reparations is the only thing I've seen that comes close to exploring that is how we can begin to take a look at the psyche around this, and the colonized psyche, the colonialism piece, and how we begin to really take a look at the disease, the disease of white supremacy for both sides, for everyone as a whole. And the only thing that I've seen that brings in how we get from here to mobilizing, I feel like Resmaa Menakem's book of My Grandmother's Hands really begins to take a look at the trauma, how we're gonna begin to metabolize so that we can get to mobilizing. Yeah. And when I say trauma, what I mean is a break in dignity, a break in belonging, a break in safety, and how we begin to really clarify, because we can't really come up with answers until we really look at it really in detail, the clarity of this trauma, this break for all bodies, because this is all bodies, right? This is bodies of all colors. And then I feel I'm bringing this up because it's the only thing that I've seen. I was in a year-long project with that book, and I'm a movement therapist. So this is very important to all of us. And I just wanted to mention that. Yeah, thank you.
I want to thank you for bringing all of that up, and I want to use it as a moment actually to talk about how my project, my White Anti-Racist Ancestry project, was very inspired by Resmaa. I read My Grandmother's Hands as I was thinking about how to respond, to the 2020 uprisings, and so this actually gets a little bit deeper into the strategizing that I was doing and that I see the project having. One of the things that Resmaa talked about that really jumped out to me was, he said, one, white anti-racist, we do a lot of head work, we do a lot of thinking, but we don't change white supremacy unless we work on our nervous systems. We don't change white supremacy unless we engage in culture building, And so I was really thinking, after reading My Grandmother's Hands, Resmaa calls for white anti-racist culture building. He's like, what does that white anti-racist culture look like that will draw people, that will compel people? Because it can't just be us thinking about it and talking all the time. And so as a writer, what I came to as I was wrestling with this culture building notion was that, as human beings, we're wired for stories. And one of the things that I saw happening in the uprisings of 2020 with white folks was there was a ton of, a lot of the material that was going viral and was being posted regarding white anti-racism was like, hey, white people, here's like 10 things you could do. Or white people, here's like 25 things, or here's some bullet points about how to be a good white anti-racist. And that's very just, there's not a lot of depth to that. That's kind of like a bullet points. You could like memorize it and pass a test. It doesn't do anything on the nervous system. It doesn't do anything on the culture building front. And so here's my thinking as a writer was, what, human beings are wired for stories. If we receive lessons in the form of story, then those lessons get into our nervous system, they get into our heart if they're put into the form of story. And so I was thinking to myself, if I write stories about white anti-racist history that bring people alive and the white people reading them can relate to those figures, and in their stories about them, there's a lot of rich and lessons about anti-racism, maybe that's a way to actually get those lessons more at the somatic level, more at the heart level, especially if white anti-racist communities can then read those stories together, talk about them, build community around them. That starts to look like culture building. So one of the things that I've been doing that I didn't say before was not only writing these chapter length pieces, but since I launched this project a year and a half ago, I've done 20 workshops with 20 different white anti-racist groups where we fully digest the lessons of Ann Braden's life, and she's a master white anti-racist organizer. And so building community around those stories, I think, is one of the ways that we do that culture building work that Resma talks about. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, just because Resma's had a huge influence on me, and he has a book coming up, another book coming out in just a month or two, I think. Sorry, Jean, I know you've been waiting there for a long time.
Thanks, Sharon.
Yeah, thank you so much for your work and for your research. You know, it's really great. I have to admit, I feel a little queasy about focusing on white anti-racists. I'm going to say, I mean, as a hopefully a white anti-racist myself, I just feel like the idea that I'm only, you know, I'm going to join the movement because I see that there are other white anti-racists, and otherwise I'm not going to, just on the basis of all the racist history we have, that I just feel a little queasy about that. I understand the whole idea of bringing everyone together and the multicultural aspect, but focusing specifically on white anti-racists feels, frankly, like slightly racist.
Yeah, no, I definitely get. I mean, it's a critique that I think is important to talk about. And there's also a related critique where some people feel like maybe it's a form of centering whiteness, where some people might be concerned that maybe it gets into white saviorhood. So I feel like all of that is important to address. So, you know, I appreciate it whenever people bring that up. So, you know, the way that I would respond to that is, you know, this is not about having white heroes. You know, this is about looking at how truly incredible, effective white anti-racists have done their work. It's about looking at, like, you know, someone like Lillian Smith has brilliant insights into whiteness and white supremacy and the white anti-racist emotional journey. So, you know, learning about these people helps us become better white anti-racists. And like, that's why it's important, because through looking at them, we can cultivate ourselves. Just like, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, look to Ella Baker, look to Grace Lee Boggs, you know, look to certain profound figures to learn from them. And I think that white people, you know, it's important that we don't try to reinvent the wheel. It's important also that we look at the mistakes that were made in the past in order to avoid them. But one last thing I want to say about white centering is, I think that the most important thing to do to avoid falling into that trap is, when we look at these figures, we shouldn't talk about them as having more power than they actually had. You know, these are people who tend to be in the background. They tend to be in some kind of support role. They're not front and center. So if we talk about them in a way where we make them front and center, then we're probably engaging in white saviorhood, and that's important not to do that. And the other thing is, you know, we need to talk about the messiness and complexity of people's lives. These are not perfect people. You know, they have a growing process. They make mistakes. You know, they're not perfect. And we need to look at all of that stuff too. And we learn a lot from looking at, you know, how white anti-racist growth plays and all that stuff too. So
I know it's only one part of your work, and I don't mean to disparage what you're doing. It just is something that may, you know, that idea of that particular focus, I was a little uncomfortable with.
Yeah, sure. No, I understand that. And you're not the only one who feels that way. And once again, I think that white anti-racists, I feel like we should be cultivating our anti-racist abilities. You know, maybe not everyone wants to look at how white anti-racists have done their work in the past, and I think that's fine. You know, and the last thing that I would say is, you know, I personally think it's important to look at how white anti-racism has been done by people like Ann Braden. But at the same time, we need to be spending most of our energy, you know, looking at Black and brown freedom struggles. That's where most of our energy needs to be. It doesn't need to, we don't need to be spending 90% of our energy looking at white anti-racist history. You know, I think it should be, you know, maybe something that we learn a little bit about, but I don't think it should be the primary focus. So
yeah, I think we agree about that. Thank you.
yeah. Thanks, Jean. Let's see.
I was unmuted. I apologize. Thank you so much for this. We're just trying to, I think we have time for the breakout rooms, but Lynn, I really appreciate everything that you've said. Connie, I don't know if you wanted to say something before we move forward. I have the community agreements.
Thank you so much, Lynn. We all really enjoyed your talk, as you see from the very spirited discussion. And we have several community agreements that we ask people to take into consideration during the conversations in the breakout rooms. And please note there'll be a facilitator in each room to help you with this. So please listen to each other respectfully so that each person has an opportunity to be heard. Please step up, step back. People are encouraged to overcome the reluctance to talk, but take care not to dominate the conversation, allow everyone to have equal airtime. Be careful not to interrupt when someone else is speaking, and please agree to respect one another's privacy by keeping this discussion and people's names and identities confidential. We ask that you embrace the concept that whatever is said or shared in this room stays in this room, and please speak from your own personal experience to avoid making generalizations. White people may feel uncomfortable when a person of color shares a hard truth. They should also understand that sharing these truths can be painful or even traumatic for the person of color. So we'll go into the discussion questions that Lynn very kindly wrote for us. What are your own experiences of solidarity or lack thereof? What do you think strengthens multiracial solidarity? What hinders it? What questions do you have about multiracial solidarity, past and present? And what actions can you take to build multiracial solidarity? What resources would help you? And we'll put these questions in the chat. So Kim is going to assign us breakout rooms. And Lynn, again, thank you so much. You did a fantastic job.
Yes, thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you, everybody.
I'm not helping to close this evening. I think maybe Linda is, but I wanted to say that one of the things that came out of our group conversation was this awareness of all the barriers that stand in our way to connection, to understanding, barriers of language, barriers of sort of cultural suppression, not everybody feeling like, oh, we shouldn't be talking about this. And then when we do talk about it, feeling like we're not speaking the same language or understanding each other. And at the very end of our conversation, a friend lifted up the possibility of bringing it back down to one person talking to one person. Get right back down to make that human connection, look someone in the eye, say, I'm not sure I understand. Can you help me understand? So just wanted to lift that up.
Thank you, Shelley. Caroline, you have to unmute.
Well, I was just going to say, is there anyone else who wanted to share what happened in their group? No? Okay. Connie?
Oh, I think you're closing. Are you, Caroline?
I will.
Okay. Oh, Connie, did you want to say something?
No, Caroline called on me. So I feel like you want me to say something, Caroline?
Yeah.
All right. I didn't take notes.
A little bit about our group. Yeah.
Yes.
But we had a nice, very nice conversation. We were lucky to have Lynn in our group, and we had a great group, even though we said we had a bad group at the beginning of it.
Right.
We talked about multicultural solidarity, and that really it requires genuine listening and sharing stories for people to really understand your struggle and to listen and be willing to have. One of our members said it really nicely, Yolanda, it's not for the faint of heart, and it takes heart. You know, so I'm proud of us all for being here tonight and working on these questions and issues. And we also invited people to get involved with Truth and Transformation, which Not in Our Town is going to be initiating. And it's an opportunity to work in cross-cultural solidarity, multiracially, for reparations and other important causes. So hope you will get involved. Caroline, you were in the same group as me. Is there anything you want to add?
No, just that perspectives is so important to the story.
Yes.
Yeah. So Lynn, again, thank you. And thanks to everybody for coming out. Next month, the student in Dr. Joy's Racial Justice and Literacy class at Princeton High, they'll be gifting us with a presentation. I believe it's usually their senior project on racial literacy. And so each year, Dr. Joy's students they blow us away with their final projects. And I don't expect that this year will be any different. So I'm looking forward to that next month, and I'm hoping to see you all there. Linda?
Yes, thank you all. Again, thank you, Lynn, for a very stimulating presentation and that led to some wonderful conversations. And when people want to take action, I want to let you know about two possibilities. And to do so, I'm going to, if I can get to the right screen, sorry, to the revised website for Not in Our Town, the events section. I get to show it off a little bit, and there are two events that I want to highlight in particular. You can see some of the others here. On Thursday, May 5th, there's going to be a community forum to allow people to participate, give input to the strategic planning process at the Princeton High School. There are a number of racially related initiatives, but it's broader as well. But to make sure that that justice emphasis isn't lost, I hope that as many people as possible will attend and share their voices. Reparations was discussed quite a bit tonight, and there is an opportunity on May 13th in Lawrenceville, our neighbors. They are providing an information session for how municipalities can create resolutions to support the bills in the state legislature to create reparations task force. So that's at the state level. And I believe these resolutions have already been passed in Newark and in Trenton and in Montclair, and it's being worked on for Lawrenceville, and I think it should be done for Princeton and other municipalities. So wherever you live in New Jersey, here's an opportunity for you to participate in bringing the prospect of reparations to our government and to highlight it and to support reparations wherever we can get it passed. And do use our website. So thank you again, everybody. June 6th, as Caroline said, is our next continuing conversation, and we hope to see you and bring friends with you as well. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank
Thank you all.
Thanks again, Lynn.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you.